In the late summer of 1991, a man named Martin Hess drove his white University Extension pickup up the gravel lane that wound along the base of the Chehalem Mountains in Yamhill County, Oregon, and stood at the edge of a steep hillside covered in gray-green lavender plants, and told Ruth Calla, plainly and with the patient confidence of someone who had never been wrong about anything important, that what she was doing was not farming. It was, he said, a hobby. It was sentiment dressed up as agriculture, and no hillside that pitched at that angle was going to sustain commercial cultivation of anything, let alone a flower crop from cuttings her grandmother had brought over from a farm stand in the Willamette Valley 30 years prior. 26 years later, in the late summer of 2017, a man named Owen Barclay flew in from Seattle, walked that same hillside with a clipboard and a small glass sample vial, held a sprig of dried hidcoat lavender under his nose for a long time without speaking, and offered Ruth Calla a contract for 11,400 ounces of certified heritage variety dried lavender at $42 per ounce. No negotiation, no counter. He simply handed her the paper. That is the story this is. 30 years. A steep hill that no extension agent believed could hold a row, and a number that landed in a county meeting room like a stone dropped into still water. If you have ever watched a confident expert look at something old and patient and call it foolish, stay close, because the Chehalem hillside had an answer for that, and it took its time arriving. Let me tell you about the hillside first, because Martin Hess was not entirely wrong in his assessment, and that matters. The slope on the north face of Ruth's property ran at roughly 32 degrees along its steepest pitch. Conventional agricultural wisdom and extension guidance going back to at least the 1970s held that cultivated row crops on slopes above 20 degrees were an erosion liability without significant investment in terracing, cover cropping, and runoff management. Hess knew this. He had the studies. He had the county soil survey, which classified the upper hillside as Willackensie silt loam over a fractured basalt base, a combination that held water in the shallow rooting zone but sheared into sheets under rain saturation without deep-rooted plants anchoring it. His concern was not invented. It was just incomplete. What he did not know, and what Ruth's grandmother Doris had understood by watching that hillside through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, was that the lavender plant's root architecture changes everything the county soil survey cannot measure. Lavender is a Mediterranean shrub that evolved on thin, rocky, calcareous hillsides where water does not stay long. Its roots go down and lateral in a patterned soil scientists call a woody taproot network, which is a technical way of saying the plant stitches itself into a hillside rather than sitting on top of it. After 5 years in the ground, an established lavender crown can anchor 3 to 4 cubic feet of surrounding soil matrix per plant. After 20 years, those root networks overlap. The hillside stops being a slope that sheds and starts being, effectively, a planted wall. Nana Doris had not used those words. She had written in her observation journal, a small green-covered notebook she kept from 1963 onward, that the lavender seemed to hold the ground the way a hand holds a book, without grip, just by being there. Ruth Calla had read that notebook so many times the binding had separated from the spine. She was 58 years old in 1991 when Martin Hess made his visit. She had been farming this hillside, or tending it, as Doris had before her since she was 19. She was known in Yamhill County for 2 things: the quiet way she had of listening to a person talk without interrupting, and the fact that her lavender never looked the same as anyone else's. Hess was 44 that year, with a doctorate in agricultural extension from Oregon State, and a calm, methodical way of presenting information that made his disagreements sound like corrections rather than arguments. He was not a bad man. He genuinely believed that small hillside operations like Ruth's were vulnerable to a set of structural problems, erosion, water management, market access, that a farmer without significant capital would not be able to address over time. His model was not wrong about most farms. It was wrong about this one, and about Lavender, and about the kind of knowledge that does not appear in county soil surveys. He simply did not know that yet. He stood at the edge of the upper terrace in August of 1991, his boots clean, his clipboard under his arm, and he said, "Mrs. Calla, with respect, lavender on a 30-degree pitch is a hobby. It is not going to generate revenue at a scale that justifies the acreage. What I would encourage you to consider is letting the hill go to managed grass cover and focusing your cultivation energy on the valley floor." Ruth looked at the hillside. She looked at the plants, which were in their third year after the last replanting from her grandmother's cuttings, and which were, to her eye, doing exactly what they were supposed to do. "My grandmother put the first ones in before I was born," she said. Hess nodded. He said he understood the sentimental attachment. He said sentiment was not a yield figure. He wrote his recommendation in a county extension summary that Ruth received by mail 3 weeks later. The relevant passage said the Calla Hillside Lavender operation represented a boutique hobby with insufficient commercial viability to warrant county agricultural support designation. He had also noted, in a separate handwritten margin comment that she thought was perhaps intended to be kind, that the operator appeared emotionally invested in a familial tradition rather than in commercially sound decision-making, and that county resources would be better directed toward operations with growth trajectories. She read the letter once at the kitchen table, under the hanging lamp her grandmother had wired in 1967, the same lamp that threw the same cone of warm light onto the same scarred oak surface. She folded the letter back into the envelope and put it in the drawer where she kept the insurance papers and the property deed and the small metal box of her grandmother's seed envelopes, each one labeled in Doris's steady hand. Then she went back up the hill. Wren was already there, moving a slow arc along the upper terrace, the way she always did in the early morning, nose to the ground between the plant rows. Ruth had gotten Wren as a pup the previous spring, from a neighbor whose border collie had produced a litter no one had entirely planned for. Wren was black and tan, compact, with a specific quality of attention that working dogs develop when they have been allowed to follow a person with purpose through the same terrain, season after season. She did not herd the lavender exactly. She simply accompanied it. Ruth had come to think of her presence on the hillside as a kind of quality check, because Wren slowed down near plants that were struggling and moved more briskly past the ones that were doing well, a pattern Ruth recognized after the second year and trusted after the third. There is something worth understanding about how heritage lavender differs from the commercial varieties that began dominating the Pacific Northwest market through the 1980s and 1990s, because the difference is the thing that eventually made Owen Barkley fly from Seattle. Commercial lavender production, the kind that went into sachets and soap and the lavender fields you could tour on weekends, had moved almost entirely toward high-yield hybrid varieties. Lavender intermediate crosses, bred for volume, bred for easy machine harvest, bred for the kind of visual uniformity that photographs well on a label. These hybrids pushed yields per plant up significantly, and they reduced the labor per ounce by a considerable margin. Martin Hess's spreadsheets liked them. The commodity buyers liked them. The problem, and it was a slow and invisible problem for most of the 1990s, was that the essential oil profile of the hybrid varieties had drifted. Not in any dramatic way. The casual nose could not tell the difference, but the fragrance compounds that made true lavender, Lavandula angustifolia, and its older cultivars, distinct from a chemical standpoint. The linalool and linalool acetate ratios, the trace terpene signature that varied by altitude and root depth and soil mineral content, those had been bred out in favor of yield. The commodity market did not measure them, so the commodity market did not miss them. The culinary buyers and the fine fragrance industry still knew the difference. They knew it the way a winemaker knows a terroir. They just could not find a consistent supply of the old material anymore, because almost every hillside in Yamhill County that had ever grown hidcote or Vera had been converted or replanted with something easier to machine harvest. Almost every hillside. Ruth Calla's 3.8 acres of steep ground held 1,200 plants, descended by cutting from her grandmother's original stock, itself sourced from an English cottage farm sale in 1959. Those plants had been in the ground, in an unbroken line of propagation, by cuttings rather than seed, for long enough that the root systems had grown into the basalt fracture zones beneath the Willackenzie layer and were drawing mineral content from a depth that commercial flatland lavender never reached. The oil that came off those flowers in a small copper still. Ruth ran in her converted woodshed was not the same product as commodity lavender. It was also, in that decade, essentially invisible to anyone looking for it because no one was looking for it there. An extension agent had told them it was a hobby. Meanwhile, Ruth's neighbor, Dale Prentice, had taken Hess's advice and a substantial amount of bank financing and had leveled the lower quarter of his own hillside in 1993 to extend his row crop acreage. The earthwork alone cost him $40,000. He planted winter wheat and ryegrass in rotation, financed a self-propelled sprayer at $85,000 and a new grain drill at another $32,000, and ran his operation the way the extension handouts recommended, with tight rotations, commercial inputs, and yield targets pegged to commodity price floors. In good years, the operation covered itself with a narrow margin. In 2002, it needed an operating line from the county farm bank to get through a wet spring that delayed planting by 6 weeks. In 2007, it needed another. The equipment depreciated on schedule. The debt service was patient, but it was always there. Dale was 41 in 1993, broad-shouldered and methodical, a second-generation grain farmer who had watched his father farm wet-ground barley on the valley floor and who had come into his inheritance with the particular ambition of someone who believes that better technology and better advice can improve on what came before. He subscribed to 3 agricultural trade publications. He attended every extension meeting. He bought the right herbicides at the right times and kept his equipment in good repair and never missed a loan payment until the years when missing them became unavoidable. He drove a green John Deere combine that he had bought used in 1995 and refinanced once, and it gleamed at the edge of his field in ways that made the agricultural section of the county newspaper send a photographer out twice. From the county road, looking east, Dale's operation looked like exactly what a successful modern farm was supposed to look like. Level ground, clean rows, a machine equal to the task. Ruth could see the combine from her upper terrace on clear mornings. She did not think badly of Dale for what he had done with his hillside. She thought he had made a reasonable decision with the information he had been given, and she knew better than most how convincing that information could sound when it arrived in an envelope from the extension office with a doctoral signature at the bottom. Dale was not a careless farmer. He worked hard, and he followed the guidance of people who were supposed to know. That is what makes what happened to him later in this story difficult to watch without some compassion, which is the correct response to it. Ruth's granddaughter Megan arrived in the spring of 1997 with a freshly completed degree in agribusiness from Cal Poly, a backpack full of reading about supply chain efficiency, and a set of opinions about the Calla Hillside operation that aligned, not by coincidence, almost exactly with what Martin Hess had written in his extension summary 6 years earlier. Megan was 24, sharp-eyed, and loved her grandmother with a straightforwardness that sat alongside a near-equal exasperation at what she saw as a fundamentally uncommercial operation being run on sentiment and muscle. "Grandma," she said on her third evening on the property, sitting at the kitchen table under the hanging lamp while Ruth sorted dried stems by hand, "you are harvesting 3 acres of specialty flower crops by hand labor with no secondary processing contracts and no retail distribution. Martin Hess is not wrong that this is not commercial agriculture." Ruth did not look up from the stems. She said the Lavender knew the hill. Meg said that was not a business model. It was a fair point. In 1997, Ruth's total annual revenue from the Lavender operation, oil sales at craft fairs, and through a few Portland herb shops, dried bundle retail, and a small mail order list she maintained with handwritten cards, came to approximately $14,000. The property was paid off, inherited, which was the only reason the operation survived. On paper, Hess and Meg were looking at the same set of numbers and drawing the same rational conclusion. What neither of them was measuring was the root structure that had been building under that hillside for 34 years. In the spring of 2001, the Yamhill County Cooperative Extension hosted a meeting in the annex of the Newburgh Community Hall to discuss a proposal for reclassifying hillside acreage under a new erosion risk designation, which would have triggered mandatory cover cropping requirements on slopes above 25 degrees. The proposal was technically sound and would have applied to Ruth's lavender fields. Martin Hess presented it. He was 54 now, gray at the temples, still methodical, still with his clipboard and his overhead projector. Ruth attended. She sat in the third row with Wren, her black and tan border collie mix, at her feet under the chair. When Hess reached the section on the Chehalem subregion, he used the Calla property as an illustrative case. He said, reading from his summary slide, that the North Face Willackenzie parcel represented a legacy boutique operation that, while not immediately at erosion risk due to established plantings, remained non-commercially viable and would not benefit from investment in compliance infrastructure. He said boutique in the mild, explanatory tone of a person who believes they are being kind. Ruth waited until the public comment period. She stood and said, "Dr. Hess, my grandmother put those plants in to hold the hill. They have held it for 38 years. I expect they will hold it a while longer." There was a brief silence. Hess said he appreciated her comment, and that the committee would take all remarks under advisement. He was not unkind. He simply did not believe that holding the hill was enough. The meeting adjourned. Several neighbors nodded at Ruth on the way out, the polite, slightly pitying nod of people who had made peace with someone else's impracticality. A woman named Carol from the Growers Cooperative touched Ruth's arm and said she thought the lavender was beautiful every summer when she drove past, which was kindly meant and was precisely the problem. Beautiful and boutique and sentimental were different words for the same dismissal, and Ruth had been receiving that dismissal long enough to recognize it in any register. Dale Prentice shook her hand at the door and said she was stubborn as a fence post, which he meant as a compliment and which Ruth accepted as one. He held the door for Wren, who walked through it without acknowledging the courtesy. And then Dale said, half to himself, that he sometimes wondered if he should have kept the lower quarter in perennial grass cover the way his father had it. Then he put his hat on and walked to his truck, and the moment passed. Wren walked the gravel parking lot beside Ruth's boots, navigating the other departing vehicles with the steady lateral attention of a dog who has worked hill terrain her whole life and applies the same caution to flat ground out of professional habit. The county road was dark by the time they reached the farm lane. Ruth sat in the truck for a moment before starting it. She was 54 years old. She had been making the same argument in one form or another for 13 years. And the argument had not gotten louder because the Hill had not asked her to make it louder. Meg had flown back to California before the meeting. She had taken a job with an agricultural consulting firm in Fresno, working with mid-sized produce operations on supply chain efficiency. She called twice a month on Sunday evenings, and the calls were warm and genuinely affectionate, and avoided the topic of the hillside with the careful mutual precision of two people who have agreed, without saying so, to protect a tender spot. The years between 2001 and 2012 were patient years on the Calla property. Ruth harvested in late July, rising before dawn to cut stems before the heat opened the flowers fully and bled off the volatile oils that collected in the tight buds. The harvest window for high-quality lavender oil is roughly 2 weeks, and within those 2 weeks, the ideal cutting time is the 3 to 4 days when the flowers are 60 to 70% open and the linalool concentration is at its peak. Ruth had learned to read that window from her grandmother the way some people learn to read weather, not from instruments, but from the color of the morning light on the stems and the way the bees worked the flowers earlier or later in the day, depending on the oil content. Commercial harvesting operations used Brix refractometers and harvesting schedules pegged to calendar dates. Ruth used the bees. She ran the small copper still through August, processing in 20-pound batches. And the woodshed smelled for those weeks like something between a garden and a pharmacy, a dense medicinal sweetness that she had been breathing every August of her adult life, and that she no longer consciously registered until a visitor mentioned it. She bottled and labeled by hand, using the same format her grandmother had designed, and maintained her mail order list, which had grown to 340 customers by 2009, most of them chefs and perfumers, and a small but consistent cohort of home herbalists who had found her through word of mouth and who ordered the same quantities every fall with the reliability of people who had tried substitutes and come back. One customer in Portland, a perfumer named Elise, who had worked with European fragrance houses before moving to Oregon, wrote Ruth a letter in 2006 saying that the Calla oil was the only domestically produced lavender she had found with the correct linalool to camphor ratio for the base notes she worked with, and that she had been rationing her previous year's supply for 6 months waiting for the new batch. Ruth put that letter in the same drawer as the Hess extension summary, 2 pieces of paper that did not know they were in conversation. She was not profitable in any sense that a bank's credit department would recognize. She was solvent, which on a paid-off property with low overhead and no debt service was a different kind of arithmetic, the kind that does not appear on a standard agricultural credit score. The property had no mortgage. The still had been paid for in 1988. The plants maintained themselves beyond the annual pruning, and the pruning she did with Wren beside her in the long-shadowed September mornings, working from the top of the hill down, section by section, The cut stems drying in bundles hung from the woodshed ceiling until they were needed for the bundle retail she sold at 2 farmers' markets in the Willamette Valley. If you have ever found yourself doing the arithmetic on a small operation like this one, wondering how it could sustain a person without scaling, without capital investment, without the kind of growth that justifies debt, pay attention to the next 10 years. The answer is in the roots. It always was. In 2012, the rain stopped. Let me tell you what a Pacific Northwest drought does to valley floor agriculture, because the specifics matter here. The Willamette Valley runs its farming operations on the assumption of reliable winter and spring precipitation, followed by a dry summer window for harvest. The aquifer and the seasonal pattern are the foundation beneath the financials. When a multi-year drought breaks that pattern, it does not break it evenly. It finds the operations that have borrowed the most against the most productive acreage and presents them with input costs that do not shrink, while yields that do. The drought of 2012 through 2015 was the worst 3-year stretch in Yamhill County in recorded agricultural memory. The 2013 winter wheat yield across the county floor dropped 41% from the prior 5-year average. In 2014, Dale Prentice's grain operation showed a net loss of $68,000 against his operating line. In 2015, a late June heat event that pushed daytime temperatures to 107 degrees for 11 consecutive days burned his ryegrass rotation before it could set seed. And the hillside he had leveled in 1993, the one that had never been replanted with deep-rooted perennials, shed 47 inches of topsoil in the single heavy rain event that followed the heat. 47 inches. That is a measurement from the County Soil and Water Conservation District's post-event survey, and it represents roughly 60 years of accumulated organic layer on that portion of hillside, gone in an afternoon. Dale owed a bank $180,000 in equipment financing at that point. He had no crop to sell against the summer payment. The combine sat in the equipment shed with the tank empty, and the self-propelled sprayer he had bought in 2008 to replace the first one sat beside it, gleaming in a way that seemed, by then, like a different kind of indictment. The county Soil and Water Conservation District sent a surveyor out to the Prentice hillside in September of 2015 to document the erosion event. The surveyor was a young woman named Joanna who had been doing field assessments for 3 years and who had not, she said later, seen a single event loss at that scale on a parcel that size in her professional experience. She took measurements and photographs and wrote a report that used the phrase unanchored mineral substrate 4 times in 5 pages, which was her technical language for saying that the ground Dale had leveled in 1993, stripped of its perennial root architecture, had had nothing to hold it when the test came. Ruth drove past the Prentice acreage one morning in October of 2015 on her way to the Newburgh Co-op for pruning supplies. She slowed on the county road and looked at the hillside. The exposed subsoil was the color of old ash, pale and flat and wrong. She drove on and did not say anything to anyone about it. On the Calla hillside, 3/4 of a mile away, the lavender plants were doing what they had been built by 2 generations of root growth to do. The woody taproot networks, some of them reaching 3 and 4 feet into the basalt fracture zones, were drawing stored moisture from depths the drought had not yet reached. The summer of 2014, which was the driest on record for the Chehalim subregion, produced Ruth's highest oil yield in 11 years. The plants stress-produced, a response common to Mediterranean species under dry conditions, where restricted water stimulates the resin glands that carry fragrance compounds. The linalool content in Ruth's oil that summer, measured when she sent a sample to an Oregon State laboratory for the first time at Meg's insistence, came back at 34.7%, which was, the lab technician noted in the report, in the upper range historically associated with true English state-grown Hidcote stock. Meg had driven up from California in the fall of 2014. She sat at the kitchen table again under the same hanging lamp, and this time she read the lab report twice. "Grandma," she said, "where did the lab send this analysis?" Ruth said she had a copy filed with the Extension office, and one with an organic certifier she had been in contact with. Meg put the report down on the table. She was 38 years old by then. She had spent 9 years advising conventional operations on supply chain efficiency, and she knew what a linalool percentage in that range was worth to a fine fragrance buyer or a culinary-grade supplier. She did not say anything for a moment. Wren put her chin on Meg's knee. "I think," Meg said slowly, "I think I owe you a conversation about distribution." The drought intensified through 2015. The county lost an estimated $2.3 million in row crop revenue that year from the combined effect of failed yields, topsoil loss, and input costs on depleted ground. At the August 2015 County Extension meeting, which Ruth attended again with Wren under her chair, Martin Hess, who was 68 now and had announced his retirement, stood in front of the same community hall annex and presented the damage summary. He acknowledged that Hillside operations with established perennial root systems had fared measurably better than row crop operations on exposed valley floor and converted slopes. He said this in the careful language of an extension scientist with qualifications. Ruth watched him from the third row. After the meeting, in the parking lot, he stopped beside her truck. He said, with the particular careful phrasing of a person revising a position they have held for a long time, "Mrs. Calla, I want to say that the data from this drought is giving me some reason to reconsider the guidance I offered on established perennial hillside cultivation." She said that she appreciated that. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Your grandmother put those plants in when?" 1963, Ruth said. He nodded slowly. He said he supposed that was a kind of data, too. Meg had been in contact with Owen Barclay through a distribution broker she knew from her consulting work. Barclay was the senior regional buyer for a Pacific Northwest grocery chain with stringent sourcing requirements for culinary and botanical products. A buyer who had spent a decade watching the heritage variety lavender supply dry up and who had received Meg's sample submission in the spring of 2016 with the kind of focused interest that experienced buyers reserve for things they have been looking for without finding. He arrived at the Calla property in late July of 2017 on a Tuesday morning, driving a rental car up the gravel lane slowly, the way people do when they are paying attention to a place for the first time and do not want to miss anything. He was a deliberate man, 52, with the kind of stillness that comes from spending 2 decades in rooms where a wrong word about a product's quality could cost someone's operation a contract. He did not waste his own time on courtesy visits. He had told Meg's distribution contact that he would come if the lab analysis held up on a second independent test, which Meg had commissioned from a Portland food science laboratory in the spring of 2017. It had held up. He came. He asked no questions at the gate. He simply fell in beside Ruth when she offered to walk the hill, and he was quiet in the particular way of a person who is receiving information through observation rather than conversation. He bent now and then to press the soil at the base of a plant crown, to look at the root emergence where the stem met the ground. to hold a flower stem between two fingers and feel the oil residue against his skin. He crouched at the top of the hill for a long moment, looking down the slope at the rows of gray-green plants in the late morning light. He asked how deep the basalt fracture zone started, and Ruth told him 6 to 8 inches below the Willackenzie layer, which she knew from the soil survey and from 45 years of watching where the roots went when plants were pulled for replacement. He nodded once as though this confirmed something he had suspected, and they walked back down. In the woodshed, he watched Ruth run a small batch through the copper still, the condenser dripping into the glass receiver at the pace it always dripped, which was slower than industrial production and produced a cleaner separation because it was slower. He held the first decanted sample, roughly half an ounce in a small brown glass jar, under his nose for a long time. His eyes were closed. Wren sat near the door and watched him with the attentive, neutral gaze she brought to strangers who had not yet been classified. He looked at the lab report Meg had set on the workbench. He looked at the jar in his hand. He looked through the small woodshed window at the hillside visible beyond the lane, green and gray-green in the late July light, the plants dense and patient on the slope that had been called a hobby for 26 years. "Mrs. Calla," he said, "how much of this can you certify per year?" Ruth told him. She said 3.8 acres, 1,200 plants, and she quoted him the 2014 and 2016 yield figures in ounces, which Meg had helped her calculate from the still records she had kept in a ledger since 1988. He looked at the numbers for a moment. "I can offer $42 an ounce for certified heritage, Hidcote, heritage chain documentation included, for a 3-year contract with an annual floor of 11,000 ounces. The room was quiet. 11,000 ounces at $42 an ounce. Ruth set her hands flat on the workbench. She looked at the still. She looked at the ledger, which had been her grandmother's before it was hers, the handwriting on the early pages in ink that had faded to the color of the lavender stems themselves. $478,800 gross for 1 year's harvest, from the hillside that a county extension agent had told her was a hobby. Meg, who was standing by the door, pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. Owen Barkley waited. He did not negotiate. He had found what he came for. The contract was signed the following week. The County Agricultural Reporting Office received the certifications paperwork in October of 2017, and at the December meeting of the Yamhill County Cooperative Extension, the Calla Heritage Lavender operation was formally reclassified from boutique specialty to primary commercial agricultural operation, a category that had not previously included a hillside lavender parcel in the county's history. Martin Hess, who was retired by then, heard about it from a colleague. His former assistant told a story later of calling him to share the yield and contract figures, and of Hess going quiet on the phone for a long time before saying that he wished he had asked Ruth Calla to walk him up the hill in 1991, that he thought he might have learned something if he had looked at the roots. That was the closest he came to saying it directly. In the years that followed, Ruth did not expand the operation. This confused people who asked about it, including a business writer from Portland who drove out to the property in 2019 and asked why she was not adding acreage or licensing the propagation method to neighboring hillside owners at scale. Ruth told him that the hillside was what it was, that 3.8 acres was what her grandmother had planted, and what the basalt and the Willackenzie supported, and that more would not be better. It would just be different, and different was not what the contract with Barkley was paying for. He was buying the specific product of this specific slope, Expanding the footprint would change what the product was, and she was not willing to trade what she had built for what she might be able to build. The writer wrote a piece about the contract that ran in the agricultural supplement of a Portland newspaper in early 2019. He mentioned the $42 per ounce figure and the Whole Foods regional distribution in the headline. And for several months, Ruth received phone calls and emails from people interested in the Lavender as a commodity opportunity, a franchise possibility, a sustainable investment vehicle. She did not return most of them. One call she did return was from a woman named Patricia, whose family owned a hillside parcel 3 miles north in the Chehalem foothills, on a slope with a similar Willikense over basalt profile, who said she had been farming winter squash on the lower terrace and leaving the steep upper section in managed grass, because everyone had told her it was too difficult to cultivate. Ruth drove up to see the parcel on a Saturday morning with Wren in the truck bed. She walked the upper slope for 20 minutes. She came down and told Patricia that the ground looked suitable, that the slope orientation was similar to her own, and that she would sell her 40 rooted cuttings at $30 each and come over twice a month in the first year to walk the hill with her. She charged nothing for those visits. She sold propagation cuttings to 11 neighboring small farms over the following 4 years, all of them on hillside parcels that county extension records had classified as unsuitable for commercial cultivation. The growers she sold to were uniformly cautious at first, none of them willing to risk more than a small test plot in year 1, which was exactly what Ruth told them to do. She walked each hillside with the same observational patience she brought to her own, reading the soil at the root crown, teaching the timing cues, explaining the stress production signal that a lavender plant sends in dry years if you know how to read it. The knowledge she transmitted had been her grandmother's first and hers second, and it was the kind of knowledge that lived in the body before it lived in any document. She wrote it into a document anyway. In the winter of 2019 through 2020, a 40-page growing guide she printed and spiral-bound and gave to each of the 11 growers free of charge. It was the first time the Calla method had been formally written down in anything longer than a journal entry. Dale Prentice had restructured his operation after 2015, sold the combine at a loss of $63,000 below its book value, and transitioned to grass seed production, a lower margin but less input-intensive rotation that did not require the equipment debt that had nearly broken him. He managed the remaining loan obligation over 4 years and kept the farm intact. In the spring of 2018, Ruth left 10 rooted lavender cuttings at his gate, with a note that said she thought the upper corner of his east slope might suit them, and that she would be glad to walk it with him, if he was interested. He called her that evening and said he was interested. By 2021, 40 plants had taken hold in that corner of Dale's east slope, and he had begun learning to read the root crowns the way Ruth had shown him. He was a methodical student. He read the growing guide 3 times and annotated it in pencil. He called Ruth on harvest questions. He named his first batch of Prentice-labeled dried bundles and sold them at the Newburgh Farmers Market at $8 per bundle, which was not $42 an ounce, but which was, as Dale said at the market table, with a slightly rueful precision, better than a net loss of $68,000. Meg moved back to Yamhill County in the spring of 2018, gave up her office in Fresno, and took over the distribution accounting and the Whole Foods certifications documentation for the Calla contract. She spent her mornings on the hillside, learning the harvest timing the way her grandmother had learned it by watching the flowers rather than the calendar. She made mistakes in the first season, cutting too early twice before Ruth stood beside her at the upper terrace in the third week of July and said to look at where the bees were working, not at the date. She looked. She understood. She was 42 years old with a degree in agribusiness and 9 years of consulting experience, and she said more than once in those first seasons that she had spent most of her professional life measuring things and was only now learning which things it was worth measuring. Ruth handed her the green notebook in the summer of 2019 at the kitchen table under the same lamp. Nana Doris had dated the first entry June 14th, 1963, and had noted that the lavender seemed to like the difficulty of the slope, that it put its roots deeper there than it would have on easier ground. The observation took up 4 lines of careful handwriting. Wren was at Ruth's feet. The woodshed stood open at the top of the lane, the small, still copper bright in the afternoon light. There are 2 kinds of knowing, and they do not often speak the same language. One kind measures what can be counted on a spreadsheet, acres and yields and cost per unit, and it is not wrong exactly, because those numbers are real. It is simply incomplete. It mistakes the map for the territory and the harvest record for the harvest. The other kind watches a hillside for decades and understands that what looks like a liability from the valley floor can be, from up close and over time, a form of architecture. Patient, invisible, building in the root zone year by year while the confident world drives past on the county road below. What is built to hold will hold. The hillside had known that since 1963. Wren lifted her head and looked at the door, and Ruth did not move from her chair, and the late afternoon light came through the woodshed window and lay gold on the copper still, and the lavender on the slope beyond stood in the slight warm wind, as it always had, holding its ground.